Welcome to this overview of transportation data to be explored as part of the Franconia Planning Board's update of the master plan. This guide has been put together by North Country Council staff to help the Franconia Planning Board explore the information and data we have available around transportation and think about what it might mean as part of your update to the master plan. First, we're going to start by introducing what is transportation data. So, transportation is simply the movement of people and goods from place to place. And transportation components include things like our streets, our sidewalks, our bike paths and lanes, bus stops, corridors, train stations and railway lines, freight distribution facilities, airports, and ports and harbors, although I don't think we have any of those in Franconia. And we include information on transportation in our community master plans so that we can explore what the efficient movement of people and goods means in a community, and so that we can align transportation goals with goals the community might have related to the use of land, economic development, housing, and how to safely expand and build upon our road networks in ways that make sense and help people to get to where they need to be and do so safely. We try and think about that for a variety of different users of the roads, bike paths, sidewalks, all of it. We have to consider the transportation needs for all of those, and we try and think specifically about folks who may not have access to a vehicle or have physical disabilities. In our communities as a whole, we're aging, and so that idea of folks who might not have access or easy access to a personal vehicle to move around or might have physical disabilities that get in the way seems to be a growing segment of our population. So, you can use this guide to help understand what available information we have about transportation and think about what it might mean for your master plan. And like I said, the data we have here was collected and prepared by North Country Council in our role in assisting the planning board in exploring these topics. You should expect that this guide is going to go over current data, give a bit of explanation. It's also going to reflect on the previous goals and objectives in Franconia's last master plan and present questions to explore and discuss as a board. Now we'll jump into the data. So the first topic we're going to jump into here is vehicles available by household. The majority, 84% or so, of Franconia households have access to one or two vehicles. That means, not surprisingly, that the primary way we move around is on personal vehicles. However, it's important to note that 11 households, or 3%, we see do not have access to a vehicle. This means that their access to goods, services, employment, schools, medical appointments, really the whole surrounding community, might be a little bit more difficult. And it's important to think about if there are good ways for, say, people to walk to the grocery store, the village market. Can people make it to the school? And what other things you might need to think about to make there be safe and efficient ways for people to get out of their homes and meet their needs. The next thing we're going to look at is commuting to work. So, we have access to some data that's collected through the Census Department that explores who uses what types of transportation to get to and from their place of employment. The table on the left side of this screen breaks these numbers down into the number of people who drive alone, the number of people who carpool, those who ride their bicycles, those who walk, those who take a motorcycle or some other motorized type of transportation, maybe a scooter, and those who work from home. Overall, we see that the vast majority of folks drive alone to their place of employment. In fact, 78.7% of Franconia residents do so. That can help us think about things like how can we encourage carpooling if we want to minimize environmental impact and reduce traffic? Or what things can we do to help build the share of people who are able to, say, bicycle or walk to work? On the right side of this screen, we have some information that thinks about how many people are coming into the community for work, how many people are going out of the community to work, and how many people live and work in the community. So I'm going to talk through each one of these because it's an interesting thing to look at. The dark green arrow headed or pointed into the town of Franconia on this graphic shows us the number of people who are employed in Franconia but live outside of the community. So these are the number of people who are commuting into Franconia, presumably most days, for work. We see that 628 people in 2020, which is our best available data for this, were commuting into the community. On the flip side of that coin, we see that 385 people were commuting out of Franconia to other surrounding communities for their jobs. And we see that the smallest share, 60 people, live and work within the community of Franconia. This slide explores the busyness of roads, and it does that by looking at traffic count data. Every year, New Hampshire DOT, who is actually assisted by our organization, North Country Council, conducts traffic counts of many of the roads across the entire region, including a good number of road locations in Franconia. This very large table here shows us the places where traffic counts are consistently collected in Franconia. And you'll see that a number of these are actually on Interstate 93, although some of them address those other larger roads in the community like 18, 116, 142, US Route 3, Mittersill Road, and Lafayette Road. What you can see on this table is when the most recent year data was collected was, and typically this happens on about a 3-year cycle. And the next column, which has AADT, which is an acronym which you'll see explained on the left side of the page, and it means Annual Average Daily Traffic. And that is the number of vehicles that pass along that roadway in a typical day in this year. So when you're looking at this, what you can see is the number of cars driving on those particular roads in that year. Now, as you move to the right across this table, you'll see the next recent year, which is, if you look at the numbers, about the last year prior to the most recent count when data was collected. And like I said, it's usually on about a 3-year cycle. So for example, if we look at the fourth one down here, we can see data was collected in 2021, and before that, it was collected in 2018. The fourth column shows that average annual daily traffic in that year basically the second year looking back of those counts. And then perhaps the most important thing to see here is this final column all the way to the right. And what this column breaks down for us is the change in traffic on those roads in that period of time. So it's comparing, say, what we saw in 2023 on Route 116 to what we saw in 2020 on that same location, on that same road. And you can use these numbers to get a feeling for how much more busy or less busy a particular roadway has become. And these are important things to think about because sometimes as a road becomes more busy, we might need to think about other ways to keep different users of that road safe, different ways to make sure that traffic is flowing smoothly and not sitting stalled, backed up at stop signs. And we can start to get a feeling for where some traffic improvements might be needed in the future, particularly when we see large and consistent increases in the traffic on our roadways. Now, like I pointed out, a lot of what we see here relates to Interstate 93, the on-ramps and off-ramps. And those might be pieces where you feel like you have a little less control on the highway itself, but those on-ramps and off-ramps do lead right into your community. I will take a moment to say a lot of this data was collected in 2020, and we know that there was some odd stuff going on about travel in 2020. So some of it has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, knowing that the COVID-19 pandemic really did, in some ways, dampen traffic trends we saw. So in some of the places we see decreased traffic, it might be worth thinking about, did that traffic really decrease, or do we think that was a little bit of a fluke related to travel changes during the pandemic? Each year in New Hampshire, there is a set of transportation planning processes that is done with the New Hampshire DOT in cooperation with the towns and the regions and several other players. And one of these transportation improvement planning processes we go through is called the 10-year plan. And the 10-year plan is basically a list of projects that New Hampshire DOT intends to undertake in the next 10-year timeline or so. Now, we don't always hit those 10-year timelines, and sometimes projects we all know will sit on the 10-year plan for quite a while before they actually come to fruition. But what you see on this page here are the projects planned in Bethlehem in the current 10-year plan as adopted in 2022. So this 10-year plan is expected to be held to for the 2023, so starting this year, through 2032. And what is worth noting is that both of these are in the interstate system, so none of them relate to roadways within the communities of Franconia. They can, however, communities can advocate and put forward projects that they would like to see in this 10-year transportation improvement program as funded by New Hampshire Department of Transportation for improvements you'd like to see, particularly on some of your bigger or more major roadways. As a planning board, sometimes it's important to discuss whether or not Franconia has a good process for identifying places where they think improvements might be needed and participating with things like the North Country Council Transportation Advisory Committee and our transportation planners to understand how to put projects forward to be considered and potentially show up on this 10-year plan. The next thing we look at here is accident or crash data. So again, New Hampshire DOT collects crash data, and they get this from a wide variety of sources: municipal police, state police, and responders who are involved in addressing the needs and responding to these crashes when they occur. And so what we're looking at here are the crashes we have seen within the boundaries of Franconia from 2017 to 2020. The map on the left shows a dot for each of the crashes that has occurred. And, not surprisingly, a trend jumps out quite quickly. It is largely along Interstate 93 and very concentrated, particularly through the Notch Parkway, where we see the majority of the crashes that have occurred during this time period. We also see some follow some of the other major roadways. For example, Route 3 headed north. We also see them in part scattered along some of the other busier roads in Franconia. We see a bit of concentration around the on-ramps and off-ramps and at the intersections right near downtown. And then a few of them, the others are just roughly scattered throughout the community without seeming to be much concentration or trend. On the right side of this screen, we have broken out when these crashes occurred, because as we know in northern New Hampshire, weather plays a huge part. And it's clear to see that the winter months produce far more crashes in our road network in Franconia than other months of the year. Although it does seem to be a relatively consistent pattern of a minimum of, say, between 5 and 10 crashes happening per month, but with a big spike we see particularly in January and February, our snowiest months. We look at crash data to think about where there might be safety issues and where safety issues sometimes can be addressed, right? And we ask, what can we do from a land use point of view to make these roads a bit safer? And it's important to know that advocating for things along the interstate highway system might be a bit beyond the control of the municipality. You can definitely participate and suggest changes, but you have more control on your local roadways in the community. And so it's worth looking at this and thinking about, where do you know there to be common accident places or near miss locations, places where you think, geez, accidents are likely to happen here, whether you've seen them or not. And then, as a community, you can think about, are there ways to calm the traffic, slow it down, make it clearer to people what to be doing, or eliminate some of these conflicts that might lead to crashes and accidents. The next thing we're going to look at is bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So, Franconia is part of what we call a tri-town bike-friendly community initiative, which is an interesting project that's been put forward between Bethlehem, Sugar Hill, and Franconia to really improve the friendliness and safety and promote bicycling throughout these connected 3 towns. And what this map on the right shows is where there are bike routes, where there are existing bike amenities like repair stations, bike racks, bike pumps, and where specifically the Tri-Town Bike Friendly Initiative is proposing to put more. In Franconia, we can see that new paint is expected to happen right through Main Street in downtown, and that a number of new bike storage places, repair facilities, and bike racks are proposed to be put in that area. We can also see where there are existing bike routes that connect these 3 communities and occur throughout. And so the question to think here is, we know that this project is moving forward roughly as planned, which is a wonderful success for the community. But we also might know that there are other places where you think it could be important to have improved facilities. So this is in here to take stock of what we know is coming and also spur a little bit of conversation on, are there places that we're missing in this project that the community might want to explore separately? Now, this is a way to think about where you might want future projects that help support people who are using our roads but not in vehicles, right? So our bikers, our walkers, our runners, and stroller pushers, other folks out there on the roadways. In this map is one of my favorite maps, but also a little bit of a confusing one. This map pulls from a website called Strava, and anybody who's a biker in the group probably knows Strava. It is something people use, usually recreational bicycle riders are sort of the most popular audience, and they use Strava to track their trips as they're riding their bikes. It's a way that they can log their miles, share it with friends, but Strava as a company uses this information in another way. They aggregate it to look at how many people are riding or walking in which places. And so they aggregate all of that data from the individual users and create this map, which is called a heat map. And it shows the concentration of busyness of roads for biking in the community based on the color. And so here it's kind of interesting to look at and see that in some communities we see certain roads that are very busy And in reality, here in Franconia, we see that many of the roads are quite busy, and I imagine this resonates true to you all. Sometimes these can be ways for us to think about if there are areas where there are sidewalks or bike paths and where there might be other improvements needed. This is part of what went into, I believe, exploring the way and the locations for improvements in the Tri-Town Bike Friendly Initiative program, but it's an interesting thing to be aware of and think about what this might help you all see. Next, I'm going to talk a very quick bit about what we saw in your 2008 Master Plan goals and objectives that relate to transportation. One objective was to develop bicycle lanes along state bicycle designated roadways. A second was to consider constructing a pedestrian footbridge over the Gale River to Dow Field. Another was to work with the state to examine safety possibilities at the intersections of Route 18 and 116, and to research ways to construct granite curbing and sidewalks on Main Street and elsewhere in the community. Also, to research solutions for access management and parking issues along the Main Street Business District. Now, access management is things like combining driveways and making sure they're not too close so that it doesn't create too chaotic and unsafe of an environment with too many people coming and going in too close proximity, which can make things prone to accidents. And last is that a notation that the town should work to balance the aesthetics of unpaved private roads with the economics of maintaining those roads. So what we'd urge you to do as a planning board is think about these goals, whether or not they're right, whether or not you understand them, whether or not they're clear enough, and whether or not they match the expectations of where you want to be going in the next 10 years as a community. Some of them might be things you've already done. Some might be things that still are important but haven't gotten reached yet, and you also might want to add to some of these. So like I sort of talked through on the last slide, it's important to always think, is this goal or objective still relevant, right? Is this still the direction we're headed in? Is this still one of the things we want to set our eyes on? 2, do we have other goals or objectives? And 3, have we already met this goal? Or, I'm going to add a fourth one in here, which is, are there other ways we know we plan to move these things forward? Perhaps are there steps you have already taken that you would like to acknowledge, and some of these goals just need to get refreshed a bit to match what you know the next steps are. Discussion is always at the heart of any update to any part of your master plan, and so here we're going to put forward a handful of questions to help guide you guys a little bit in thinking these things through. 1, what areas would be best served by additional bicycle and pedestrian facilities? Do folks know the sorts of facility improvements that are planned to be coming down the pike to you all as part of the Tri-Town Bike Initiative? Are there other areas that you want to look at too? 2, what improvements could be made to reduce the vulnerability of the transportation network to flooding and other natural hazards? Are there roadways that you see flood often or erode very often? And is there improvements that might need to be made to make those less vulnerable and to make the transportation network a little bit stronger when we see, say, strong rains like we have this summer? 3, what local and highway infrastructure investments could be made to better support and enhance the local economy? Also, in what ways can the community provide greater access for all residents to employment, goods and services, and other daily needs? 4, what design, safety, or other standards could create better environments for the drivers, bicyclists, and pedestrians in Franconia? And last, does Franconia participate in processes like the Regional Transportation Plan and the 10-year Transportation Improvement Program to advocate for local improvements to the roadways? Does the Planning Board understand how that process works? Does the road agent? How about the Select Board? And how does that work to make sure that you're advocating that resources available to make improvements, come to Franconia and meet the needs you'd like to see. So these are a few of the guiding questions. They're certainly not the only ones to ask, but we're hoping to plant a seed with you all of some things to discuss. And as a closing piece, we'll say, if you've got questions, comments, clarifications, always get in touch with Monica. And later this fall, we'll come back and join you all at a meeting where we can talk these things through and think about some of the more substantial questions on what you'd like to see happen or what's still a little unclear in the information and where it can go from there. We hope that this guide gave you a good starting point to start thinking about ways to update the master plan and why it's important that you think about transportation as a particular angle in this plan.